Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 39 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus chapter 24, beginning in verse 1, and we're going to be exploring through Leviticus chapter 26, ending in verse 13. Y'all know the drill. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, folks, so our reading picks up today in Leviticus chapter 24, wherein the Lord gives to Moses instructions for the lamps that are in the tent of meeting. He also gives him instructions on how to handle blasphemers that come into the camp. And then lastly, on how to deal with individuals that have acted out violently against other people or against animals. So the first thing I want to make mention here is just the preparations that are supposed to be made for the lamps. The Lord tells the Israelites and tells Moses that he wants olive oil to be used for the lampstands. This is essentially to ensure that the lamps don't burn out through the night, because they are supposed to be placed on gold stands in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and they're supposed to burn all night and through the morning. Here, the Lord also tells Moses that they're supposed to take the finest flour and make 12 loaves of bread, and the bread was arranged into 2 stacks, and they were placed on this gold table, and incense would be burned near the bread. And so the bread was supposed to be food for Aaron and his sons, because they were responsible for the offerings that were presented to the Lord. So the Lord doesn't want them to go hungry as they're doing the Lord's work. Moving forward, we have this interesting section which is talking about a blasphemer. So essentially, what ends up happening is that the son of an Egyptian father and an Israelite mother got into a fight with an Israelite. The man took the name of God in vain, which is a blaspheming manner. And when the people heard him, they brought him in front of Moses so that Moses could judge his offense. And so the Lord issued a judgment to Moses. The Lord said that the man was to be stoned to death by the people outside of the camp. And he told Moses to tell all the Israelites that anyone who blasphemes is to be stoned to death. Whether the person is an Israelite or a foreigner, they're supposed to be executed by means of stoning. And this is because blasphemy is a major offense against the Lord. Now, the other instructions that are thrown in here at the end of the chapter talks about other death penalties. And this is essentially for anyone who kills another person, anyone who injures another person was supposed to receive the same injury. So it's the eye for an eye, the Hammurabi's Code. And so essentially, if someone knocked out someone's tooth, their tooth also had to be knocked out. If anyone kills an animal, they have to reimburse the owner for the cost of the animal or give them another animal to replace it. Moving forward to chapter 25 of Leviticus. Within this chapter, the Lord presents instructions about allowing Sabbath rest or rest in the 7th year for the land. He also offers guidelines on the year of Jubilee, on being fair to one's neighbors, and laws that are concerning property. So, rest for the land. Essentially, God tells Moses to remind the Israelites that this was God's land that he's given them. And they should allow the land to rest, just like they rest, every 7 years, so that they could honor him during this time. So when they're not planting things or doing a harvest, they're supposed to be in worship to the Lord. So it's a whole year dedicated to the worship of the Lord rather than working the land. And during the 7th year, they weren't supposed to plant any seed. They weren't supposed to do any work on the land. But they would have enough food to feed everybody, including their cattle, even though they haven't grown anything during that year. So it's just a year dedicated to worshiping the Lord, so they don't have to work. Now, the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee is the 50th year. And essentially, a man blows the horn of a ram, so like a shofar. And essentially he does this on the Day of Atonement, and it was to announce this special time. So the year of Jubilee was a time when land that was purchased during the preceding 49 years was returned to its original owner. So essentially, if someone sold something off because of debt, they would be able to receive it back in the 49th year. And also, ultimately, this kind of resets the playing field so no one got extremely wealthy or extremely poor within those 49 years. It helps create a balance. So essentially, the value of real estate was adjusted to account for the time period between Jubilees. And so God instructed the people to be fair about the price when selling land to their neighbors. And he said to honor him and to be fair to one another. So the Israelites would follow these guidelines and the land would not be productive for them otherwise. So if they followed the guidelines, then the land would be productive because they had listened to the Lord. Also in here, God gives instructions on how to treat the poor. So the poor are supposed to be treated with dignity and respect. It's kind of interesting, just this concept, dignity and respect are associated with the poor, which was contrary to just, modern society. Lots of times that doesn't happen. I mean, even in that day and age, the poor generally weren't treated with dignity or respect, but God commands it to be so, that all people are supposed to be treated with dignity and respect, in particular the poor. And the poor could live with them as visitors in their home and not be charged any interest for money that was loaned to them. So if someone's having a hard time and you loan them money, you can't charge them interest on that because that would be taking advantage of their situation. Essentially, you're supposed to be humane to them and not exploit them because they're poor. And God said that the people essentially should not make the poor work like slaves. Instead, they should be like hired workers until the year of Jubilee, and then they would be freed. So the year of Jubilee resets everything. Lastly, there are some guidelines within this chapter, within Leviticus 25, that talk about slave owners. And so essentially, there are rules for those who own slaves. So those that own slaves could pass their slaves on to their children. And then that these slaves could also be purchased and freed if someone from their home country or a relative buys them. And in some cases, God said that if the slave could make enough money, they could also purchase their own freedom as well. So there's lots of opportunities for this not to be generational, but for slaves to be able to get out of slavery. All right, folks, moving forward to Leviticus chapter 26. In Leviticus chapter 6, it outlines how God is going to bless those that follow his rules. And it details that if those disobey his word, they are going to suffer the consequences and suffer for their sins, iniquities, or transgressions. And so the story or this chapter begins by reminding the Israelites of the few of the rules that God wants them to follow. They shouldn't worship false idols, create monuments to honor anyone else aside from the one true God, and that they should keep the sanctuary holy and the Sabbath holy as well. So it is here with the two different pictures of the life that you can have. If you follow the decrees, it says, I'll make the country a place of peace. You'll be able to go to sleep at night. I will chase out your enemies and I will defeat them. I'll make sure you prosper, make sure you grow in numbers. If you keep my covenant, you'll still be eating from last year's harvest when you have to clean out your barns and essentially throw away the old food to make room for the new food, because I'm going to bless you that much. I'm going to set up my residence in your neighborhood. This is because I am your God, the God that rescued you from Egypt. So this idea of prosperity lies in contrast to those who disobey. Those who disobey will be facing debilitating disease, high fevers, blindness. Their life will be leaking out little by little. The enemies will come and eat their crops. God will turn his back on you. And the people that hate you will end up governing over you. And so really we have two very contrasting pictures, a life of prosperity or a life of despair. And it ultimately depends on whether or not the Israelites, personally and corporately, are willing to allow God to govern their lives and submit themselves to him and his statutes and commandments. It is here in verse 13 of chapter 26 that we end our reading for tonight. All right, folks, I hope that you will join me tomorrow for day number 40. We're going to take a look at Leviticus chapter 26, picking up in verse 14, and reading all the way through Leviticus chapter 27, ending in verse 34. That is the end of Leviticus. So we're also going to pick up and take a look at Numbers, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to be reading all the way through verse 41. All right, folks, hope you've had an awesome day, and as always, God bless.